Thanks very much. Great to be with you. I came up with the title, Music, Marilyn, Monroe, and the Upside Down World of Piccolos, when I got the invitation to be part of this meeting. I came up with the title, but I didn't write the speech at that time. And so when I was given the title, just a few days ago, I thought, what on earth was I thinking of at that point? So, having come up with the title, the thinking stopped at that point, and now I'm left with catching up with myself. So I've come up with the following for you. And this is going to come a little bit out of left field for you, but I hope that you stay with me right to the end, because it should be bang on the subject for today. So I'm going to invoke somebody who is pretty unpopular, much maligned, criticized, denounced in many places, and that's Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud, whose name I mentioned to a colleague just a few days ago, and she said, that's so 100 years ago. But I would compare Freud with Homer, with Shakespeare, with Montaigne, Cervantes, somebody who really understood the human psyche. And perhaps his best discovery of all was to classify childhood as a distinct period of life, rather than as the life of a young adult. I personally consider that to be very important. So I'm going to use Freud's analysis of the psyche as the basis of understanding the construct of a city and how important and integral the arts are within that structure. Sounds a bit daunting, I realize, but as I say, stay with me. So let's remind ourselves of the three parts of the psyche that Freud analyzed and put forward. First of all, there's the id. The id is our most authentic, childlike self. It's creative, it's passionate, it's artistic, it's full of desire, it's full of impulses, all driven by the pleasure principle. If you've been with a 3-year-old for an afternoon, that is sheer id. Okay? Then there's the superego. The superego is the absolute opposite of the id. It's dealing with right and wrong, it's irrational in its choices, it's realistic, it's guilt-driven, that's where all your guilt comes from, and it's intent upon controlling the excesses of the id. It promotes the tyranny of should have. How many times do we hear that in our lives? And then there's the poor old ego, the bit that we all see, the most visible bit, if you like, caught between the powers and the opposition of the id and the superego, and trying really, really hard to find a balance, converting sex and aggression into a more acceptable expression of the id, and modifying the id into artistic expression. As human beings, we've all been there. This is our daily lives. It constitutes our daily problems as well. We know the joys, we know the excesses, we know the continuing conflicts, the possibilities, the tolerances of the mind, and how we have promoted our minds and psyches as the structure of our cities, just as our homes represent our private minds and what our psyches consider to be important. So let's take a look at the construction of the ego with its desire to have reason and common sense and some form of equilibrium. This is what the ego can create, and does create very, very effectively. It creates education, it creates schools, it creates universities, it creates the architecture of our cityscapes, our green spaces, our tree-lined boulevards. The superego creates our social structures, our governments, the buildings we place our governments in, be they the Parthenon in Athens or the White House in Washington. They create our police forces, our armies, our rules, our laws, our religions, our churches, our penitentiaries, our inflexibilities, and our social conflicts. And then our id. Well, it is great fun dancing and taunting our ego and superego, helping to create and challenge our society and the cities we live in by making them more extraordinary, but only with the balancing influence of the ego. Only the creativity of the id and the ego could have conceived of the amazing glass structure that now announces the Louvre in Paris, appealing to thousands of other psyches. Only Brunelleschi's id and ego could have come up with the Duomo in Florence, or Christopher Wren's St. Paul's Cathedral, or Geary's Disney Hall, or the Isabella Stewart Gardner Palazzo. Imagine creating a palazzo in Yankee northeastern America, which houses the veritable contents of her psyche. It is the psyche that provides the desire to perform, to paint, to act, to design, to dance, to dream, to write, to return to the imagination that made childhood a distant country where everyone and everything was done differently. And in this desire to make an accomplice of the ego in building great institutions that house the goals of our civilization, drama companies, theatre, Cirque du Soleil, street artists, musicians, orchestras, a far cry, dance companies, designers, composers, writers, choreographers, filmmakers, thinkers, philosophers, people and works that change our lives, make our lives worth living, give us a handle on infinity and on death and on birth. It was Beethoven's id and ego that gave us the great symphonies that the BSO performs. John Singer Sargent that provided us with the astonishing collection at the MFA. Shakespeare, whose psyche today entertains thousands of people on Boston Common every single summer, enthralled to the dramatic psychological constructs that even Freud found to be exceptional. Icons, such as the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building, are not only the signature of the great city of New York, but also the manifestation of the id as the most potent masculine symbol of the power of the city. And the Brooklyn Bridge is the city's most sensuously feminine. Cities have embraced the arts as their most extraordinary and most creative signatures. And where this has happened, in the most all-embracing fashion, we have created world-class cultural destinations. Just consider the following. London, with the beauty of the Globe Theatre on the River Thames, or the Royal Albert Hall, or Lincoln Inn's Field. Paris, with Notre Dame emerging out of the soil, out of the earth, out of the solidity of what is beneath, seeming to be unbidden, seeming to be unplanned, and right and monumental and magnificent. The Blue Mosque in Istanbul, surely one of the most magnificent structures in the entire world. The giant bean, I always call it the bean rather than the cloud gate, in Chicago's Grant Park, created by Anish Kapoor. Just to walk around it, to touch it, to see families, to see faces, all reflected. That is absolutely magical. Boston and its library, created with humanist zeal and confident splendor, to allow access to the greatest works of our civilization, available to absolutely everyone. New York's Guggenheim Museum rolling in rings higher and higher in Frank Lloyd Wright's design. Barcelona's Gaudi Cathedral, still under construction 150 years after they began it, a temple to being a melting ice cream. The hilltop town of Taormina in Sicily, where you cannot tell where the rock finishes and the town itself begins. It's all the same, it is all continuous. Remember that architecture is frozen music. Music is the written word in sound. Dance is the handmaiden of music. The written word tells our story, the story of mankind. And we illustrate this all in design and pictures and food and wine. We experience and enjoy the recognition of our innate selves, recognition of ourselves as creative, artistic, imaginative beings, a being that can sit in a sidewalk cafe in Paris, staring at that most priapic of all structures, the Eiffel Tower, sipping a glass of wine, thinking that life is pretty cool, with absolutely no sense of guilt, not even a little bit. On his special trip last week to Boston, President Obama had this to say about our great city. You have great universities which year after year welcome the greatest talent in the arts, in science, in research. And there is a Boston diaspora that excels in every field of human endeavor. We have a humanist president in a long line of humanist presidents, starting with Jefferson, celebrating the place of the arts as a vital part of our city, making it distinctive and making it exceptional. And that is why the creative cauldron of a city is important. It is why it attracts the finest and best minds to be part of its life and being. It's why ids and egos have come together to create ideas that shape our very lives, from Cubism to Expressionism, the Bauhaus, Humanism, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, Tom and Jerry, the movies of Alfred Hitchcock, Death of a Salesman, Italian fish soup, and the unspeakable beauty of the back of a violin made in Cremona. The arts do not make a city. The arts are the city, and without them we are left with the drab, dead monstrosities of East Germany and communist Russia, where the soul of our id and ego have been crushed between the huge intersecting powers of an all-dominating superego. Let the city flourish in its love of art. Let Marilyn Monroe go down to the Charles River to play her piccolo. Thank you.